Did you know that dinosaurs still exist until this day? In fact, their descendants are the birds we see now. You heard that right. Even the hummingbird, who only weighs 5 grams, has a 500-pound ancestor. And if we apply this weight ratio onto the average human weight, we would have an ancestor who weighs over 3,000 tons, which is equivalent to the weight of 21 blue whales. Science can help us explain this phenomenon with a process called evolution. Evolution is defined as a process in which living things change and develop over generations. Every single species on Earth today evolved from an ancestor species who existed before them. We can trace this back to the very first life on Earth. Let's use a timeline to represent the history of all life on Earth. Please note that this timeline is not drawn to scale. Although some microfossils discovered in Canada suggest that the first lives appeared 4.28 billion years ago, the earliest undisputed evidence indicates that the first life existed about 3.5 billion years ago in the ocean. They are single-celled simple organisms, which we call prokaryotes. About 1.85 billion years ago, the first organisms with cells similar to ours called eukaryotes emerged. These cells are bigger and more complex. Throughout the majority of the past, all life on Earth were single-celled marine organisms. Around 500 million years ago, the oxygen levels in the atmosphere had risen to sufficiently provide support for organisms of higher complexities. As such, the Cambrian explosion occurred. It was an explosion in the emergence of more complex species, who developed traits such as bones, spine, eyes, mouth, and tentacles. They spread across different levels of depth in the ocean, forming a prototype of our modern marine ecosystem. In fact, the ancestors of many marine organisms today emerged back then, and because of the emergence of larger-sized predators such as abnormal shrimp, more complex food webs emerged, which you can think of it as a web of producer-consumer relationship of food. But you might be wondering, how did these simple single-celled organisms evolve into these complex creatures? It sure seems like a miracle. To understand how this happened, we need to understand some mechanisms that make evolution happen, a system of heredity involving units called genes. Genes can be thought of as the blueprint of traits that get passed down from generation to generation. They are the instructions for how your body gets made. Genes are made up of tiny molecules that exist inside every organism called DNA. The difference in genes is one of the leading causes of variation in physical traits as well as behaviors. We all have a wealth of genetic information in our DNAs, and they get passed down through reproduction. However, the encoded genetic information could mutate if errors or recombination happens. Both mutations occur on the molecular level where the encoded genetic information is changed. This causes genetic variation, the difference in the genetic makeup of individuals, and this in turn manifests itself in different phenotypes and diversity of life. So, single-celled organisms didn't just suddenly become these complex creatures. From slight changes occurring in some individuals and species over time, these small changes accumulate into more noticeable changes. Hence, species of these complex creatures emerged. But how? But now that we know how evolution created different species, you might be still wondering why evolution created those species in particular. In other words, why did life evolve the way that it did? Let's move forward in time to 370 million years ago. According to scientists, a species named fish reef appeared around this time. They were the earliest amphibians, the ones who lived both in water and on land. But what exactly led the evolution of marine animals to adapt to land? The evolutionary concept of adaptation explains the change in these organisms. As we stated before, mutations can occur for individuals and populations. In some cases, the variations in their genes increase their likelihood of survival. For example, a giraffe who has a longer neck can reach more leaves in these taller trees and have access to more food, while giraffes who mutated to have shorter necks are not able to reach the leaves, and they starve. These giraffes who are less adapted to the environment will demise, together with their less adapted genes. In contrast, those who have the fittest adaptations pass on their long necks to future generations of giraffes in their population. This is a process known as natural selection, the change in the traits of a population over generations. This is why some of the species that live today have evolved bones to store nutrients and to support their muscle structures. Meanwhile, others have grown eyes to see prey and predator more clearly, mouth and teeth to chew food, and limbs to catch prey. This can also explain how species evolved with unique characteristics to survive different biomes and ecological systems. Adaptation, as well as natural selection, is why more and more land organisms emerge through time. They would benefit from the lack of predators and the abundance of resources, and they would eventually evolve such that they could stay on land permanently and spread to drier, harsher climates. Organisms with better adaptations are more able to survive and reproduce, which increase the number of individuals who have the adapted gene. An example is the modern Arctic fox. They change their fur color to white to camouflage themselves from their enemies, and when the winter is gone, their fur turns black to match with the brown dirt in her environment. This is a type of physiological adaptation, a body process that increases the chance of survival and reproduction. There are also other types of adaptations. For example, the fox might shelter herself from the blizzards during winter by burrowing into the snow, and she might also have genes that encode for sharper claws, make hunting and digging easier. The former is called a behavioral adaptation, and the latter is a structural adaptation. In general, the organisms with the best adaptations are able to pass on their adaptive genes better than those who are less adapted. Therefore, we say, metaphorically, nature selects the most adapted ones to proliferate. The evolution of life is not only influenced by natural selection, extreme events also play a crucial role. For example, let's take a look at the Mesozoic era, the era of the dinosaurs. During that time, dinosaurs were the dominant animals on Earth, but one time an asteroid struck the Earth and caused massive devastation to their habitats around the world. The impact launched dust into the atmosphere that blocked out the sunlight for potentially months. As a result, around 3/4 of life on Earth went extinct. Most of the dinosaurs went extinct. The tree-dwelling birds also went extinct because of the global deforestation. However, some land-dwelling birds which evolved from dinosaurs survived the catastrophe, and they slowly became the birds today. Primates evolved from small terrestrial mammals about 85 to 55 million years ago. Here we see their descendants include both Staphyrians and Haplorhines. They later evolved into tarsier monkeys and apes, who was our ancestors. You might ask, how did the scientists know the relations between species with such detail? To form an understanding of the connection between species, scientists create a phylogenetic tree to map out the evolutionary relationship. They study various lines of evidence. The first line of evidence is developmental studies. Developmental biologists study the embryos of different species and compare them across various stages. By studying during which time do the difference in the embryos emerge, scientists can figure out the degree of relatedness between different species. The second component is morphological studies, the form and structure of an organism. For example, humans, birds, and whales share homologous or similar features in the arm. This provides evidence for divergent evolution, meaning they share a common ancestor despite having different traits. However, sometimes a red herring called analogous features might cause confusion. Analogous features are the result of convergent evolution. An example is the wings of bats and birds. Although both bats and birds have wings, they do not share a common ancestor. How do we know? Because of the study of molecular biology, genetics. By comparing the genome size of bats and birds, we see that they are not closely related. We can also compare the DNA sequences, if you recall, encoded in a blueprint to determine their relatedness. The earliest humans developed out of southern apes after about 3 million years ago, most likely in Eastern Africa, where the oldest known stone stools were found. From various types of pieces of evidence, for example paleontology, morphology, and genetics, scientists found that not only does our species, Homo sapiens, the Latin word for wise men, evolve from apes, we actually had many close relative species, the Neanderthals, the pale-bird man, and the broken hill man. But why did our cousin species become extinct? They had big brains too, and they had stone tools. And they buried their dead, which means they had cultures. They were also hardier than us. For example, the Neanderthals endured for a long time in the comings and goings of ice ages. So what happened? Whenever glaciers and permafrost reach Europe and Asia, it appears that the Neanderthals moved south to take advantage of the warmer climates. However, during one cold period, while the Neanderthals retreated, the Homo sapiens began to infiltrate the colder regions. How could we do this, especially since we were dispersing from tropical Africa? Some scientists hypothesize that Homo sapiens evolved better ways of adjusting to the weather fluctuations, which is the key to adaptability. The difference is that we developed the ability to invent new tools, like sewing needles to produce warm, body-hugging clothing. Besides that, preserved beads and stones suggest that we, but not the Neanderthals, maintained social networks over vast areas. Nevertheless, although we invaded the territories of the native Neanderthals and might have driven them to extinction, the Neanderthal gene are found in most Europeans and Asians, which suggests that the interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Oh, and here's a fun fact. By tracing the lineage of all currently living humans, we share the same great-great-great-great-grandma who lived between 100 and 230,000 years ago. If we compare our journey of 3.5 billion years to 24 hours, she lived only 3.7 seconds ago. So, in a sense, we are a big family who is more closely related than we might think. To conclude our video, have you learned that evolution is driven mostly by natural selection and that the fittest genes are passed on to future generations? Have you gained insights on how all lives on Earth are a unity despite the diverse ways we appear and behave? Lastly, keep in mind that evolution is a unifying theme of biology. It draws from paleontology, morphology, embryology, and genetics. This video barely scratches the surface of what evolutionary biology has to tell us, and we left out many other important concepts. One is genetic drift, which is a variation in genotype frequencies due to random chance. And the other is gene flow, the change of gene variation in a population due to migration. If you would like to learn more about evolution, please visit the links in the video description section. Finally, thank you for sticking with us through our entire journey of over 3.5 billion years.